my stance is that what Trump did and what Walz did are both totally okay, above book, and even should be applauded. Staying out of unjust wars, not going and killing innocent people over lies is a good thing. I will always cheer it. I will always support it. I will always stand it. Hey guys, I'm Hannah Cox with Base Politics, and you're watching the weekly Base Politics show. Don't forget, if you like these episodes, to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Or if you're listening on audio, head over to Spotify or to Apple and leave me a review. That really helps to get the word out on those platforms as well. Also, a little housekeeping today before we jump into the episode. I am so excited for this to come out. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, I filmed my second debate with the Jubilee Media Network on YouTube. Back in December, I filmed a debate called Capitalists versus Communists that went over really well, if I do say so myself. And so I was excited to go back into the fray. This time I was debating gun control. For those of you who don't know, I actually got my official start in politics working on Second Amendment issues. I'm super passionate about this topic, even though I feel like it's one that doesn't come up in my work as often as I wish it did. I am still so pro Second Amendment, especially as a woman, especially as a feminist. I think that gun rights are so fundamental for women's rights. So I was thrilled to be invited to come back and debate, and it is coming out on their channels this Sunday, August 11th. I will probably also be clipping some content from my channel, maybe even making a response video. I will save my behind the scenes commentary for that, but please do mark your calendars, check it out, spread the word. I feel very proud of how this went over. Okay, now for the news of the day. The one bad thing about this show is that it comes out on Friday, and so much happens in the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday news cycles leading up to Friday that oftentimes it's hard to fully encompass everything I want to talk about or have as timely of responses as I'd like to. So I'm going to do my best here to hit the high points of the week. And a lot of them have revolved around the new Democratic nominee for vice president, Tim Walz. Now, there are a number of fronts I could discuss Walz on. Obviously, with being thrust into the spotlight with this nomination, there has been a plethora of news stories about this guy that honestly, the vast majority of us had never heard of before. I was pretty familiar with J.D. Vance before he was nominated, thanks to his book, and also, I guess, just following GOP Senate politics more closely. Walz was somebody who was in Congress. I mean, congrats for being in Congress, but we all know, most people cannot even name their own Congress member, much less anybody else's. So he had not really hit my radar in that capacity. And after he left Congress, he went on to be the governor of Minnesota, where it seems like the most amount of media attention he got was during the BLM riots of 2020, because obviously that was where they really kicked into high drives. So I, like the majority of Americans, have been mostly learning about Walz for the first time this week. And because there is so much scrutiny on his record, we're seeing old media clips, we're seeing policy positions. So I really like these kinds of news cycles, not because I care whatsoever about the actual election or either party really, but more so because I think they give us such a good chance to really talk about public policy in a meaningful way, which honestly is increasingly few and far between these days. I got into this work because I really love talking about public policy, finding solutions for people's lives, killing bad public policy that will hurt people in their daily lives. And yet, as the culture wars have vamped up and really as the Republicans and Democrats have just become so much more hyperpartisan and tribalistic, we rarely get to talk about the things that actually matter. So these kinds of news cycles are fun because they kind of give me a wedge issue. So I want to talk about one of the big controversies that blew up around Walz over the past week, and that has to do with him essentially draft dodging. Now, obviously, we haven't actually had the draft since the Vietnam War, but basically it seems that he got out of going to Iraq. I want to roll you this clip from J.D. Vance criticizing him for that move.
When the United States Marine Corps, when the United States of America asked me to go to Iraq to serve my country, I did it. I did what they asked me to do it, and I did it honorably, and I'm very proud of that service. When Tim Walz was asked by his country to go to Iraq, you know what he did? He dropped out of the Army and allowed his unit to go without him, a fact that he's been criticized for aggressively by a lot of the people that he served with.
Now, J.D. Vance might have thrown the first punch in this fight, but this has been picked up across the political spectrum, and he is getting completely trounced for this on the right. I'm going to read you one tweet of literally hundreds I saw criticizing him and piling on. This is from an account on Twitter by the handle JoJo, and it says, Tim Walz is a deployment dodger. In the 60s and 70s, men were jailed for dodging the draft. Walz joined the military of his own free will and then bailed on deployment when he was going to see combat. Inexcusable and cowardly. Now, my response to this is probably a little bit outside of the box, but not entirely. I've seen other people echoing similar things. But my initial gut reaction to this clip from J.D. Vance was as follows. I said, I think that's based. The Iraq War was an abomination that killed tons of innocent people, hurt our economy, and that was fought on false grounds. Few people opposed it at the time. Those who stood against it were proven right in the end. I just don't think, quote, draft dodging or refusing to fight in wars plays like it used to in politics, but it certainly isn't going to land for most when it comes to the war on terror. And I think that for a number of reasons. First and foremost, the war on terror is deeply unpopular. And while I think it will still take several years for us to fully analyze and examine all of the failures within it, the consensus across the spectrum is that Iraq was a catastrophic mistake that was made by our government at best. At best. You know, there are many other people who would say it was not a mistake. It was very intentional what they did there. And they're war criminals, the people that were behind pushing it in our government at that time. I probably fall more in that camp myself. The second reason I think that this does not land as it used to is I remember, like when I was in high school, military service used to be really important, if not imperative, to get power, okay? I remember when I think it was John Kerry was running against George W. Bush. I was in about 10th grade at that time, but this was a huge point of contention. Bush had already been criticized for not having really served boots on the ground in a war. I think Clinton had been pretty severely criticized for that as well. And I think Clinton might have been the first U.S. president, in my memory, that had not actually fought in a war. And then they, in opposition to Kerry, really went after his medals that he had gotten and whether or not his service was legit. This used to be something that could actually hurt you in politics. I don't think that that is any longer true because I think, thank God, the temperature with the American people when it comes to how they feel about war in general has drastically shifted. We are becoming so much more educated on those conflicts. We are having the benefit of time to look back on the consequences of things like the Vietnam War and to recognize what colossal waste they were and how unjust many of them were. And so it is no longer seen as this scarlet A to have not served your country or fought in these unjust wars. Because to be frank, while I think most people go into the military with the best of intentions and they really love their country and they want to support their country and defend it and defend the Constitution and the things that we stand for, since my birth and since the birth of my parents, if you are signing up to fight in the military, the wars you're fighting are not that. That's not what you've been doing. And I think we have a growing recognition of that. And proof of that concept is the 2016 election with Donald Trump, where it became a top headline story that he himself was a draft dodger. He had used bone spurs in his feet in order to get out of serving in Vietnam, and it did not hurt him. He also went so far during that time period as to criticize John McCain for his war service. He said, and I quote, "He's not a war hero. He was a war hero because he was captured. I like people who weren't captured." And that still didn't dent him, which was pretty obviously offensive to many people besides just John McCain and his family. I saw another tweet calling this out from a Twitter account by the name of Emily May. She was quote tweeting Joel Berry from the Babylon Bee, who was attacking Walz over this controversy, but who was very, very diehard Trump. And she said, "These dudes are voting for a man who dodged the draft because of fake bone spurs and who will in the same breath denigrate any veteran who disagrees with him." And that really is the irony here, okay? My stance is that what Trump did and what Walz did are both totally okay, above book, and even should be applauded. Staying out of unjust wars, not going and killing innocent people over lies is a good thing. I will always cheer it. I will always support it. I will always stand it, no matter which camp the person finds themselves in. And since it seems many of the atrocities of the Iraq War are already starting to fade into the background, I just want to give a summary of what I think is now like concrete, objective facts around what happened in Iraq and why it was such a failure. I don't even think there are still people in either major party that would dispute these beliefs. This is reporting from ASPI Strategist, and they said the Iraq War took the lives of some 200,000 Iraqi civilians and 4,600 U.S. soldiers. The economic costs to the U.S. were in the range of $2 trillion, and the war upset the balance of power in the region to the benefit of neighboring Iran, which has increased its sway over Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, in addition to Iraq. The war also isolated the U.S., owing to its decision to fight alongside only a few partners and without explicit backing from the United Nations. The war ultimately proved to be a costly distraction. Without it, the U.S. could have been in a much better position to reorient its foreign policy to contend with a more aggressive Russia and a more assertive China. So, lots and lots of people killed, tons of money spent, our economy crippled because of it, and no real gains. You just destabilized the region. You enabled many of our enemies to coalesce into stronger bonds. You weren't paying attention to actual threats that were gaining on the national stage. And again, all of this was done based on a set of lies that the American people were sold. This is reporting from The Intercept, where they say it is still difficult to peel back all the layers of deceit that enveloped the war. Some were thin and nearly transparent, like the fabricated generalship of Albrecht Muth. Others were enormously consequential, like the false assertion peddled by the White House, the CIA, and the American press that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Along with other official lies, it morphed into a lasting conspiracy theory that set a dangerous precedent and helped pave the way for the rise of Donald Trump. The assertion by the Bush White House that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. There was never any evidence that it was true, and the Bush administration knew it had nothing to support the claims. In response to me on Twitter, one commenter said, "Oh no, Walz walked out on an unjust war where he may have been killing civilians if only the rest of the troops had followed his example." Now, to be totally clear, I did not know the circumstances under which Walz refused to go to Iraq. So I wanted to dig in because at first glance to me, it seemed like most likely this was a conscientious objector who was taking an out that was provided to him. It seems pretty clear that he didn't actually do anything illegal. He basically was able to take early retirement and he opted into it. And if I was in the National Guard, which means I signed up as a civilian who's still going to work part-time or go to school to be on guard to defend my local neighborhood and communities, and then all of a sudden I find out I'm getting sent into this unjust war that has absolutely nothing to do with defending our national sovereignty and that actually could destabilize us and make us a lot less safe, then heck yeah, I'm going to take early retirement and not go into it. But I did want to see, is there any evidence that he was acting in this kind of principled way, or was he just a coward, as many on the right are trying to claim? And I found some interesting reporting that I want to read to you. This is from Reason. The headline says, Tim Walz is against unaccountable wars, but he voted to fund them anyways. Ugh. The article says the year was 2007, the Iraq War was in full swing, and Congress was struggling to exercise its oversight. Despite a Democratic blowout in the midterm elections driven by public opposition to the war, then President George W. Bush wanted to surge thousands more U.S. troops into Iraq. Democrats proposed a resolution condemning the plan. A freshman representative from Minnesota, a retired Army master sergeant named Tim Walz, stood up in support of the resolution. Quote, "Some have said that this debate sends a message to our enemies, and I would agree. The message our enemies are hearing this week is that democracy in America is alive and well," he said. "The geniuses of the founders of this country are on display right now," Walz added, praising Congress's constitutional role in overseeing war. Walz is now governor of Minnesota, and on Tuesday, he became the Democratic candidate for vice president. Picking him could be a sign that a future Harris administration might exercise more foreign policy restraint. Vice President Kamala Harris, National Security Advisor Phil Gordon, has also built a public profile around learning from the mistakes of regime change campaigns such as the Iraq War. For all his strong feelings about war powers, however, Walz has also shown a tendency to shrink from tough political fights on the issue. During the debate over the surge, Walz voted to force the U.S. military to withdraw from Iraq within 90 days. Yet less than 5 months later, he voted to continue funding the war. It was a position that put him at odds with the majority of his Democratic colleagues. Quote, "In my district, I wasn't hearing during the campaign an overall cry that the troops have to be out by midnight tomorrow," Walz told NBC News. My fear is if the pullback of the troops was either delayed or sped up based on politics, that's dangerous. A similar pattern unfolded throughout Walz's congressional career. According to voting records compiled by Peace Action, an anti-war advocacy group, Walz often voted to repeal the War on Terror-era authorizations for the use of military force, known as AUMFs, while also voting against restrictions or cuts to military funding. When we broke with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, then President Barack Obama asked Congress for a new AUMF. The bill authorized war but excluded, quote, enduring offensive ground combat operations against the Islamic State and, quote, associated forces for a 3-year period. Walz thought it was a good compromise option. He said the president is trying to get a fine line between not tying his hands and recognizing the fact that Americans, I would say rightfully so, are worried about open-ended conflicts. When that bill failed, the Obama administration claimed the war was authorized anyways, of course they did, under the 2001 AUMF against Al-Qaeda and the 2002 AUMF against Iraq. Walz continued to push for war powers reform and against any congressional enforcement of those reforms. For example, in May 2016, Walz voted to repeal the 2001 AUMF. The following month, he voted against a bill that would put an expiration date on war funding under the 2001 AUMF and against another bill that would defund military operations in Iraq and Syria unless a new AUMF could be passed. This middle-of-the-road stance continued under former President Donald Trump. In 2017, after Trump ordered airstrikes against the Syrian government for using chemical weapons against civilians, Walz stated that the bombing was clearly warranted, even though any further military action needs permission from Congress, especially if it may risk putting more of our men and women in uniform into harm's way. Okay, so let me give you my interpretation of that voting record. To me, that is somebody who is anti-war and pro-veteran at the same time, which is a wonderful combination. I would say that's where the vast majority of libertarians, people in my camp, stand. And I think that to a large degree, these kinds of votes are not altogether inconsistent, because while you might be anti-war, voting politically to defund military campaigns, voting to move troops in a more expedient manner than perhaps makes sense, that can be very, very dangerous for the troops. And we saw that with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which absolutely should have happened, but was a hot mess the way it was done, and it got innocent people killed. I also see, when I look at this kind of voting record, somebody who is a rank and file Congress member, and at the end of the day, you don't have that much power, right? This is such a false perception people have about people who get sent to Congress or even to the U.S. Senate. Like, I would argue once you're in the U.S. Senate, you have a little bit more power just because you have a bit more notoriety, right? It's not because you actually structurally have more power. It's because you have more access to a bully pulpit via the media. More Americans know who you are. But when you're in Congress, you don't even have that. And regardless which chamber you're in, you are at the behest of your party's leadership. Your actual ability to come in and vote as you want is so limited. They don't even let you read the bills half the time. And if you break with your party leadership and how they want you to vote too often, you will be out of office very expediently, okay? They will spend a ton of money to come and run against you. They will strip you of like your committee positions, which is really the only way that you get to like meaningfully interact with policy. Once something's on the actual floor of the House or Senate, you're just kind of having to vote as is. Being on a committee is how you can actually influence policy. They'll take that away from you like that. So to me, what I see with this voting record is somebody who's anti-war, but he's not out here Ron Pauling it. And that's because most of them simply don't have the guts to stand up to their parties, nor do they have the notoriety or the fan base to be able to do that and stay in power. It's as simple as that. But to me, this guy does read as somebody who's pretty anti-war, and I think that it's very plausible he did not support the Iraq War and didn't want to go for those reasons. Again, I wanted to look this up. The National Guard, it was founded in 1636 as a citizen force to protect towns and families from attacks. As I mentioned, today's National Guard soldiers, they frequently have civilian jobs, they attend college, and they just do their military training part-time. They were structured to be a last line of defense, right? Because if we are sending our military over into actual conflicts, actual wars, and they're defending us abroad, and let's say there is a real existential threat on the homeland, we would have the National Guard in place to defend us. It's a very honorable thing to sign up to do, but it's also very different than signing up to be full force in the military, or at least that's how it used to be. But as we've seen with the massive bloat of the military-industrial complex in recent decades, the nature of serving in the National Guard has changed quite rapidly. This is from the Army's own website, where they say the National Guard is a unique element of the U.S. military that serves both community and country. The Guard responds to domestic emergencies, overseas combat missions, counter-drug efforts, reconstruction missions, and more. So again, I can't be in this person's mind. It's not really actually relevant to me, but what I will say is for many people who I think probably signed up honorably to serve in the National Guard and would rise up and defend their communities and neighbors if attacked, they are very justified in saying, I signed up to do this. I did not sign up to do all this crap, right? I certainly didn't sign up to go fight unjust wars. I certainly did not sign up to go fight wars that actually could increase the likelihood of us having a real threat here on the mainland. So I'm sorry. If it's Trump, if it's Walz, I don't care who it is. You are never going to convince me that getting out of going into an unjust war is a bad thing. Now, a more fair critique, I think, that I saw many people making in response to my comments about Walz and this whole controversy on Twitter, this person said the issue is Walz trying to have it both ways, playing up his service while never having deployed to a war zone, and specifically cutting and running on his troops that were counting on him. So I wanted to explore this a little bit more because, like I said, zero problem with you not going to fight in this war. That being said, if you are lying and running around and touting service you did not complete, and especially if you're trying to use this alleged service to argue against basic rights here, which it seems like he has done, because my friend Sarah Higdon, who is a veteran herself, she made the point that Walz actually tries to use the service to remove Second Amendment protections. He actually said, we can make sure those weapons of war that I carried in war, that is the only place those weapons are at, but he never went to war. Now, these are great criticisms that I think are fair to make, and yet it's not what I hear the geniuses in the GOP doing. I saw this thread from Peter Meyer. He's a former representative out of Michigan. I really like him, and he also has a military background. And he said, gonna piss off everyone with this take, but what the hell? I think Walz played fast and loose with his military bio to stay above water as his congressional district drifted right. He let audiences paint in their minds a deceptive picture. It was shady, but not stolen valor. Walz alluding to, quote, weapons in war that I carried in war to give credibility to his pro-gun control stances intentionally sought to paint this deceptive picture, just like saying, I deployed during OEF. But he didn't claim unearned medals or lie about being in Iraq or Afghanistan. Some earlier reporting bought the deceptive picture I mentioned above, but that's not Walz's words. I've had reporters say or write that I was a Marine or an Afghanistan vet. Trickier was, quote, combat vet, which I didn't claim, but others have described. His burden to correct. I would try to correct reporting on me. I definitely wasn't a Marine, and though I spent 18 months in Afghanistan versus 9 months in Iraq, fact is I was a civilian in Afghanistan, not in uniform, though in much more danger. A veteran of the conflict in a sense, but not in the sense Afghan vet connotates. Whether the mobilization retirement timing was coincidental or a dick move is something I think only the enlisted soldiers in his unit can say. I know one or two have spoken publicly, it was a dick move, but I'd like to hear from a plurality to account for personal beefs. He also responded to people who have said that Walz basically claimed like a different rank than what he actually had during his service, and Peter Meyer again said, guys, I could not care less about Walz calling himself a retired CSM versus former CSM. It's inaccurate, but where is the valor he's trying to steal? Close to zero civilians know or care about the difference, and close to zero vets will be impressed by the difference. Like, count me in on that, okay? I don't know the difference. It means absolutely nothing to me, and it just seems a little bit nitpicky to latch onto. Still, though, I was still trying to fact check and see what actually happened. Did he do something wrong? Did he actually lie? And I have really interesting counter fact checks. And this, guys, is, I think, the biggest problem that we face when it comes to the media. The media, for the most part, is no longer doing actual investigative journalism. They're not actually really trying to get to the bottom of things. They're looking for gotchas to make their case from one end of the spectrum to the other. So I went to The Hill, which tends to be a more moderate right-leaning news source, and here's what they said. Both Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and Senator J.D. Vance tout distinguished military records, but clashes over the specifics of their years in the armed forces were quickly ignited between their camps this week after the vice presidential matchup was set. Vance, who served in the Marines, took the opening shot Wednesday at Walz, who served 24 years in the National Guard. The Republican presidential nominee accused his Democratic rival of stolen valor for leading service before deployment to Iraq and claiming he served in a war. I wonder, Tim Walz, when were you ever in war? Vance said at a campaign stop in Michigan. He has not spent a day in combat zone. I'd be ashamed if I was him and lied about my military service like he did. Vance appeared to be referring to a clip of Walz, which the Harris campaign shared on social media, in which the governor says, while speaking about gun control, We can make sure those weapons of war that I carried in war are only carried in war. Walz has not served in combat. The Hill has reached out to the Harris-Walz campaign for comment. Supporters of Walz have pointed out that Vance admitted in his memoir that he never saw real combat either, and that Walz has never misrepresented his rank. Jacob Thomas, communications director and a spokesperson for the progressive veterans group Common Defense, said it was weird and desperate to attack a fellow veteran's military record. That just doesn't seem like a winning message, he said. We don't need to spend this time hitting each other on things that don't matter. We all served, and like I said, frankly, it just reeks of desperation. Walz and Vance stand out as veterans on national tickets, the first since late Senator John McCain ran for president in 2008. Former President Trump famously avoided the draft during the Vietnam War after being diagnosed with bone spurs, and Vice President Harris did not serve in the military at all. But then I saw counter-reporting from Breitbart, where they have a headline that says Kamala's running mate broke pledge to deploy to Iraq in 2005. He said he had a responsibility to serve if called on, and they say that then congressional candidate Tim Walz broke a promise in 2005 to deploy with his U.S. Army National Guard unit if deployed to Iraq despite his ongoing campaign. While saying he would still continue his congressional campaign regardless, Walz said in a press statement, "As Command Sergeant Major, I have a responsibility not only to ready my battalion for Iraq, but also to serve if called on." He also suggested that he was willing to leave his wife and daughter behind to deploy to Iraq with his unit. Ultimately, Walz left the military while the rest of his unit deployed in Iraq. And I will flash this press statement from Walz at the time up so you can read it for yourself. And I guess where I end up falling in this whole controversy is I don't think he did anything wrong, but I don't think he did it for the right reasons. Sounds like he did kind of bail on people. Sounds like he did lie. And seems like he hasn't tried all that hard to correct false perceptions around his record and instead has leaned into them for his own political advancement. But either way, at the end of the day, I still think it's worth noting how little these kinds of attacks matter anymore when they used to matter so much. Yes, this is Twitter online fodder and they're going to shoot their shots back and forth. But out in the real world, I want you to see how draft dodging is actually being discussed.
All right, y'all. Biden just bombed Yemen because I guess a boat couldn't pass. So here's the top 5 ways to dodge the draft. Number 5, doodling yourself. Now, this has been done a couple times in the past, but I just don't want to smell that in the draft room. So that's why it's at number 5 for me. Number 4, get a lamer birthday. It's not going to work for Geminis like me, but it might for someone else out there. Number 3, leave the country. If y'all find a good one, let me know. And number 2, just don't go. Just go to jail for a couple years. That's rent paid, food paid, no upkeep of anything, no commute, no nothing. Why would I not do that? And number 1, baby, you know I was going to say conscientious objector. You know I was going to say, for religious reasons, I can't kill kids overseas, man.
These videos are getting tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of likes. They're even giving instructions on how to get out of the draft if they re-implement it, which I stan. Watch this last video. This one is hilarious.
Draft dodging is a federal crime.
Not jail.
Have you managed Gen Z kids? You don't want that smoke. I'm talking to you, U.S. government. If you try and reinstate a draft, I'm going to tell you what will happen. You'll have so many conscientious objectors that your prisons will be overflowing. But the problem is, you have a bunch of kids who are very good at collective bargaining, very good at starting things. So what would be the first thing that would happen inside those jails that you would put these draft dodgers in? Oh, they would start a revolt. 100%. And then the Gen Alpha kids that, aren't in the draft will probably end up helping them. Yeah. These newer generations, don't fuck with them when it comes to oppression. Don't.
Honestly, I don't really think the political capital is there for them to try to re-implement a draft anytime soon, or if at all. But I also do think that the country has changed so much on these issues that last video is absolutely right. There would be so many conscientious objectors. It won't happen again like it happened in Vietnam. People will refuse, they will revolt, they will riot, and they will be right to. So as a whole, I just think these kinds of political attacks, they really fall on deaf ears. And the people who really buy into them are very out of touch with where the American people actually are on the military right now. Okay, well, while I guess like I 50% support Walt in the first controversy, the second one I want to talk about, I'm going to come for his throat because this man just used his full vocal cords to basically attack free speech.
I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy.
Tim. Listen, I am far from delusioned about the state of our politicians. Like, I know the best and the brightest they don't go to work in politics at all, much less government, much less run for office, okay? The bright minds go and do pretty much anything else. But this is ridiculous. This is such a basic concept to grasp. Making this kind of statement on live national television, like I would be so embarrassed to be this wrong on national television. And I cannot fathom thinking that you should be in leadership over the country and any kind of position if you don't have at least a foundational understanding of our basic rights. He is dead ass wrong on free speech, and so is the rest of his party, because what he's saying is a typical party talking line at this point. It's the same thing with capitalism in them, right? I support capitalism, but, and then they give this whole long spew of sentences that show they absolutely do not support capitalism and completely want to dismantle it. Same thing with free speech. I support free speech, but we have to look out for hate speech, especially disinformation. Wrong. And especially when it comes to like the disinformation, so wrong as to be, I think, an enemy of the essence of free speech, because you cannot have free speech without having disinformation. It is through that discourse that we are actually able to figure out what's true, what's valid, and what's not. I'm going to turn your attention to FIRE, which is, in my opinion, the absolute best free speech advocacy group in the country. And they have an article titled "Why Most Lies Are Protected Speech and Why They Should Stay That Way." The subheading says, even with our current climate of fake news, misinformation, disinformation, and election lies, we shouldn't use government power to try enforcing the truth. Interestingly enough, their article actually deals with a case of stolen valor, which I just think is very ironic. Tim Walz, it's so ironic. They say, during a meeting of the Three Valley Water District Board in Claremont, California in 2007, Xavier Alvarez stepped up to introduce himself. "I'm a retired Marine of 25 years, he said. Back in 1987, I was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor." These were lies, and Alvarez was in the habit of telling them. In the past, he had claimed he played hockey for the Detroit Red Wings and that he had once been married to a Mexican starlet. But by purporting to have received a military medal, Alvarez had taken his dishonesty into new and more serious territory. He had violated the Stolen Valor Act of 2005, which criminalized lying about having or receiving a military honor. Alvarez was indicted and pled guilty to the charge, but appealed on the basis that the law itself was unconstitutional, content-based restriction of his right to free speech. In other words, the statute restricted speech specifically based on what it is saying, in violation of the First Amendment. The Supreme Court agreed, writing, "Absent from those few categories where the law allows content-based regulation of speech," Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote for the majority, "is any general exception to the First Amendment for false statements." Moreover, Justice Kennedy noted that some false statements are inevitable if there is to be an open and vigorous expression of views in public and private conversation, expression the First Amendment seeks to guarantee. The court's analysis recognized two critical points. First, that bans on specific lies are content-based restrictions on speech. Second, that in order to preserve the freedom of expression the First Amendment defends, lies must be protected the same way as any other speech. The short answer to why lies are constitutionally protected is that outside of a few narrow and formally recognized categories of unprotected speech, the First Amendment is neutral regarding the content of the speech it defends. This principle was expressed beautifully by Justice Thurgood Marshall in the 1972 Supreme Court case Police Department of Chicago versus Mosley, which questioned the constitutionality of a city's ordinance banning non-union picketing outside of a school building. In the majority opinion, Marshall wrote, "The First Amendment means that government has no power to restrict expression because of its message, its ideas, its subject matter, or its content. This means that the First Amendment almost universally prohibits content-based regulation of speech. Because they target the substance of speech and are easily used to suppress disfavored ideas, content-based laws or regulations are presumed unconstitutional, and the government must meet a very heavy burden to justify them. That burden is known as strict scrutiny, the highest standard in First Amendment law, which requires the government to prove the regulation furthers a compelling interest and is narrowly tailored to achieve that interest, as outlined in Reed versus Town of Gilbert, Arizona et al. Interests are compelling, the First Amendment Encyclopedia explains, when they are regarding regulation vital to the protection of public health and safety, including the regulation of violent crime, the requirements of national security and military necessity, and respect for fundamental rights. And I'll just pause here to say that while strict scrutiny is good and it is a very high bar to meet, that loophole is already too big for me, okay? Because under the guise of public health and national security, the government gets away with all kinds of free speech violations, so you need to be on guard for those terms. Back to their article, though, they say the key here is that any regulators must not only advance a compelling interest, but must also not restrict our ability to speak freely and dishonestly beyond what is necessary to further that interest. And this is why the Biden administration is going to lose their TikTok ban lawsuit to us, Base Politics. I've covered this on the show before, but because they did not apply a strict scrutiny methodology to their infringement into this issue, they do not meet the level that they needed to in order to take these kinds of actions. And I want to clarify here briefly because there are a few number of areas of speech that are illegal that the First Amendment does not cover. But I think the way people typically discuss them or talk about them is usually not exactly correct. So I want to give you FIRE's interpretation on this for clarity. They say, as noted above, not all expression is protected by the First Amendment. The Supreme Court has identified historic and traditional limitations on a few well-defined and narrowly limited classes of speech. These include incitement, true threats, and obscenity. They go on to say when it comes to lies or dishonesty in particular, there are a few forms of it that fall under constitutionally unprotected speech, such as fraud, perjury, and defamation. Even in these cases, though, it's not so much the lies themselves being acted against, but rather their specific and measurable consequences. With respect to perjury, for example, false testimony in a criminal trial can lead to a wrongful conviction, affecting the life and liberty of an innocent defendant. Likewise, fraud in the form of false advertising or other deliberate misrepresentations made for economic or personal gain can be criminalized due to the clear material cost imposed upon those who fall prey to it. So it's less about the speech that is criminalized. It's more about when you have an instance of speech that has led to actual crimes and actual harms against somebody, that it becomes unprotected. Even when we talk about defamation laws, right, which is something Brad and I at Base Politics as public figures are constantly frustrated by, because as public figures, we have even less of an ability to defend ourselves against defamation. It's an even higher barrier when you're a public figure. People can pretty much say just about anything they want to about you, and it's very, very hard to have a case and defend yourself. But even for rank and file people, the burden for speech to become defamation is really high. FIRE lists these 6 components in order for there to actually be defamation for a plaintiff. They have to establish these 6 elements, which is 1, they have to prove that the publication was of and concerning to them specifically. 2, that the defamatory statements were disseminated to a third party. So it can't just be that I say something wrong about somebody to somebody else. It has to be that we are then giving that to a newspaper or something along those lines. 3, the statements in question have to actually be defamatory. So you have to be able to prove that they're false, which is not always as easy as you would think. 4th, they have to prove the statements are false. Truth is an absolute defense to a defamation claim. Generally, the plaintiff bears the burden of proof and establishing falsity. 5 is statement of fact. They say the statements in question must be objectively verifiable as false statements of fact. This means the statements were presented as true facts, but demonstrably false. And 6, you have to show damage. You have to show that the false and defamatory statements must cause actual injury or specific damages. So this is a lot to prove, right? It's a very, very tough thing to do, and that's why you very rarely see defamation cases succeed. All that to say, Tim Walz is completely, disgustingly wrong on free speech, and because he's currently being accused of stolen valor, he should probably look into the case that revolves around that very issue. Okay, well, speaking of other massive cases that you need to have on your radar, this is one of those instances where I wish so badly I was recording every day because I wanted to talk to you about it when it happened and I had to wait till filming on Thursday. But on Monday, we just got a landmark decision in the case against Google that was brought by the U.S. Justice Department. This is an antitrust case. This is something I have been warning you guys about and talking about for months, and it's bad. It's very, very bad. So they lost this case. This is actually the first antitrust case against the tech sector that has succeeded in over 20 years. The last time we saw this happen was with Microsoft around 2000, and that decision has been pretty thoroughly derided over the past couple of decades and seen as ridiculous. And it was so bad and so useless that's why you haven't really seen, I think, many other similar motions succeed against this industry in the years in between. But as you know, if you've been following me, Lina Khan at the FTC, the Biden administration in general, they have been gunning to gear up antitrust in this country again. And fortunately for us, they've been failing at most of their attempts, but this one was successful. So let's dig in, because I think the ramifications of this decision could be colossal. I'm going to turn your attention to a Newsweek article I wrote discussing the case. I said on Monday, a federal judge ruled that Google violated antitrust law and acted illegally in order to maintain its monopoly in online searches. There is just one glaring problem. Google is not a monopoly. Not even close. In fact, there are over 30 other search engines in the world that are dedicated solely to search functionality, including Yahoo, Bing, and DuckDuckGo. Additionally, websites like Amazon, TikTok, and even Pinterest have placed increasing competition on Google in recent years as consumers have begun using these websites for all manner of searches, from products to DIY tutorials to medical advice. The ruling marks the first antitrust decision in the modern tech era, and its implications could be far-reaching for our legal framework, our economy, and consumers. In the case, the U.S. Justice Department argued that Google acted in an anti-competitive nature by securing agreements with companies like Apple and Samsung that ensured their browsers were auto-downloaded to their devices. They also argued that over 90% of web searches are conducted on Google search engines. In reality, consumers have always had the ability to download their preferred search engines to their phones or delete the apps that come pre-programmed to their devices. In securing these deals, Google did not block other search engines from being accessible, nor did they force anyone to use their products. They just made them more convenient to access, which is a perfectly reasonable step for a business to take. Google disputes the claim that 90% of web searches are done on their engines, but even if they were, the company's popularity indicates one thing and one thing alone. Consumers like Google products and want to use them. The company has in no way harmed consumers, defrauded anyone, or even acted in an unfair way towards their competition. Being smart enough to negotiate such deals simply makes Google better at its job. For decades, antitrust law has hinged on conservative legal jurisprudence known as the consumer welfare standard. And this is big, guys, okay? It's a very good legal precedent that defenders of capitalism and limited government worked hard to enshrine into law following a disastrous period of aggressive antitrust pursuits by the U.S. government in the 20th century that crippled our economy. The consumer welfare standard says that in order to have breached antitrust laws, 3 conditions must be met. 1, the company in question must be a monopoly, which is an extreme rarity. 2, it must have used its monopoly power. And 3, it must have done so in a way that harmed consumers. No serious person could argue Google crossed any one of these lines, much less all 3. Yet the case against Google is one of many the government has brought in recent years, many of which have come from the FTC under the aggressive and anti-capitalist reign of Chair Lina Khan. Khan's agenda, which has been supported by the Biden administration and populists in both parties, such as Senators Elizabeth Warren and Josh Hawley, seeks to overturn the consumer welfare standard and return our antitrust landscape to that of the mid-1900s. According to these types of business, being big means it is bad, rather than the obvious truth that a business becoming big merely means it is popular and offers a product or service consumers quite like. And their solution to bad big business is always the same. The government needs more control of the economy and private companies in order to, quote, protect consumers from these evil corporations. But antitrust enthusiasts always tip their hand, revealing antitrust as a Trojan horse. The same people who openly hate capitalism are always claiming we need more of it in order to save capitalism. But capitalism doesn't need saving by the government, certainly not from monopolies. In a true free market system, failures come naturally and swiftly as better competitors emerge, products become outdated, or bloat takes over. Monopolies rarely exist at all and never for long under capitalism. Despite the fact that our economy is more mixed than free market these days, supporters of antitrust are still hard-pressed to identify actual monopolies in existence. In fact, the only long-standing monopolies that come to mind are government-created or backed, think the public school system, or certificate of need laws that block the infusion of new healthcare suppliers. Google lost its lawsuit, but the real losers are the American people. Not only could this decision prohibit Google from offering quality products millions of us enjoy, it also means it will be harder for the next competitor to get their foot in the door. And that's because the thing they are being targeted for is one of the things that has made them successful, for being smart, for being ingenious, for going and finding new ways of doing things, and therefore saturating the market in such a way where consumers readily are aware of their products and choose to use them. You are criminalizing that and saying it violates antitrust law, which means for the next competitor to come in and compete, they're going to have to find ways around that. I have to say the responses to this article when it came out were jaw-droppingly stupid, you guys. Like, School choice must pass, okay? We must get school choice programs across the finish line because this country, this experiment, it will not last with a population this dumbed down. I want to show you a few of them. This is a guy who, according to his bio, has worked for Ron DeSantis and currently works for the Florida Department of Commerce, okay? This is a Republican administration. This is somebody that seems to be working within it. And this is his understanding of a free market system. He quote tweeted me and said, "So there are over 30 other search engines trying to compete, and yet Google has a 90% share of the market and is signing exclusivity agreements to package theirs in new operating systems. Sounds like a monopoly." Like, do we mail them dictionaries? I truly don't know. Like, having a monopoly in a market is bad. I think everybody can agree to that. But also, I would say it wouldn't last very long under true free market capitalism because a monopoly would attract competition by very nature of existing. A company existing in a market where there are over 30 competitors, okay? And that's on the low end because like I said, all kinds of other websites also have search engine capacities. But let's say there's 30 other competitors and Google has a 90% usage rate, which again, they dispute themselves. But let's say that's true. That's not a bad thing. That means that they are popular. That means that people are choosing to use them. That means that they are giving products that people like. What these types are mad at is that the people they don't like are succeeding, okay? And that's where this comes down. People on the right think Google is a left-wing company, and therefore they want to stick it to them. And then people on the left seem to just hate success in general. I saw somebody quote Ayn Rand at me in the comments of this article, and I want to read this quote because it's spot on. She said, "There's only one meaning and purpose these laws could have, whether their authors intended it or not. The penalizing of ability for being ability, the penalizing of success for being success, and the sacrifice of productive genius to the demands of the envious mediocrity." If you don't like Google, you are free to take the extra, 60 seconds it will take for you to access another search engine. Or you could go out and start a competitor and run it as right-wing and conservative as you want. That's your prerogative. But to come in and try to use the government as a weapon against companies you don't like is anti-capitalist, okay? Let's hold hands and say it together. You're an enemy of capitalism. And this guy kept going. Then he tried to say to me, 38 different state attorneys signed on for the suit against Google. When is the last time you saw 38 states agree on anything? To which I responded to him that it's happened quite frequently, and pretty frequently it's happened over issues he probably likes, okay? Having a bunch of state attorneys generals team up and agree on something is your top signal that they are just trying to get themselves more power either over the market or over you. And yet this seems to be a common way of thinking amongst conservatives, which I think is so interesting because I saw this in my comments a lot. Someone said, "Oh, I didn't realize you knew more than the elected AGs who argued this case." Yeah, I probably do know more than them actually. Have you met attorneys who work for the government? Again, not their best and brightest, okay? It's not good attorneys go and do literally anything else and make good money. These people are very, very uneducated on the Constitution. There's also this false perception you go to law school, you're an expert on the Constitution, when in reality, I think most lawyers take maybe a class on constitutional law. That's not what they're training you for in law schools. And yet these same people who would balk when you say, listen to the experts at the CDC, will come in and write this kind of crud in my replies. Being in office does not make you especially smart. I'm sorry. Having credentials, having a degree, also really not an indication of somebody having superior intellect, and certainly not an indication that that person is well-versed on the Constitution or cares to defend it, much less economics. Also, what I think is really interesting is that the U.S. has had a much better regulatory landscape, particularly as it pertains to antitrust, than Europe has for the past couple of decades. And the drastic difference because of that between the two economies and tech sectors is vast. But because of that, we've already seen Europe penalize these same kinds of actions by Google and others overseas. And what we have seen overseas is that people still seek out Google, even when it's not pre-programmed on their phones. A recent study and various reports indicate that iPhone users in Europe overwhelmingly choose Google as their search engine, even when it's not the default option. Despite efforts by European regulators to promote competition by enforcing a choice screen where users can select their preferred search engine upon setting up their devices, Google has maintained a dominant market share of around 90%, which is exactly what it is here in the US. This suggests that a significant majority of users actively choose Google over other available search engines due to its perceived superior search quality. This trend highlights that user preferences for Google search capabilities are strong enough to overcome the influence of default settings, reflecting a broader pattern of users gravitating towards the search engine they trust the most, even when alternatives are readily available. So the only people you're hurting with these kinds of decisions, well, you're hurting the market, you're hurting the economy, you're hurting like future businesses, but mostly you're hurting consumers. You are violating the consumer welfare standard, which is supposed to be in place to protect consumers, and instead stripping consumers of the choices that they are making because you don't like their choices. This is also really ironic. Apple has said that there's no price Microsoft could offer to pay them in order to make them ditch Google, even if they offered us Bing for free. Additionally, worth knowing, roughly 500 million people per year leave Edge and Bing for Chrome or Google by literally searching for Google products on Bing. Adrian Moore Reason said, if Google's dominance depends on default placement, why do millions of people use other search engines to literally search for Google? But as you can see, I went to ChatGPT to give you a picture of what this looks like for the future. Go ahead and take a few seconds to examine these. If you're on audio, I'll read a few of them for you. But when you look at the vast difference right now between our economy and Europe's, especially when it comes to the tech sector, it is absolutely crazy. Our economy and our country have benefited so drastically from having a better free market, more free market, I guess I should say, landscape. And now we are steadily trending in their direction, and it just makes absolutely zero sense. For one, venture capital investment differences in the U.S. in 2023, U.S. tech companies received around $250 billion in venture capital funding compared to European tech firms that got around $100 billion. We also see that U.S.-based companies represent 7 out of the 10 largest global tech firms by revenue, whereas European companies lagged behind in global rankings, with few making it into the top 10 at all. Also in 2023, American firms filed over 300,000 patents, reflecting a strong culture of innovation. European firms filed fewer, around 150,000, reflecting a slower pace of innovation. ChatGPT summarized it and said, these comparative statistics underscore the significant differences in how antitrust laws impact the tech sectors and economies in the US and Europe, with many analysts arguing that Europe's stricter regulatory environment has hindered its economic and technological competitiveness. And for those of you who hear this kind of thing that sounds like pie in the sky to you or like very abstract, these are the kinds of things that trickle down and you don't feel them until it hurts, okay? It's like when the government printed a ton of dollars and spent a ton of money under stimulus spending, and Americans were like, yay, free money, what could go wrong? And then they're living with crazy high inflation, they can't buy a house, and they're losing their jobs, okay? That's this kind of thing. Are you gonna feel it tomorrow because of this decision? No. But as these things are allowed to stand and as legal precedent begins to be built upon them, because this decision makes it easier for the next antitrust and the next antitrust and the next antitrust case to succeed, you will notice it. Your economy will stagnate. You will have less innovation. You will have less competition, which means you as a consumer will have less options. You'll have fewer jobs. Your GDP will go down and your quality of life will decrease. And if people do not learn how to think these things through a few steps back in order to engage and take action when it matters, we're done for. We're done for, okay? There are so many people that are being absolutely duped by populist talking points around these kinds of cases right now and are getting tricked into selling out the very core beliefs they still try to claim of limited government and free market capitalism because one company is too popular and they don't like that company. Like, please, dear God, get it together. It is so bleak to watch. All right, guys, that's a wrap. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Can't wait to read your comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next week, stay based.